Alright, so a few thoughts about the team policy topic for NCFCA, and I'm going to start off by being very, very candid. I'm going to give you my straight opinion. This topic is terrible. I may be stepping on some people's toes, I may be hurting some feelings. I'm to the point where I don't care. This is so poorly written. This is so non-directive. I mean, it really won't surprise me if next year the topic is resolved that somebody should do something involving molecules. It really is important when you're going to write a debate topic that it be about a live controversy, that there be some sort of channeling, that there be some sort of valence to the topic, and this one just has none. It has an unbelievably broad subject area. It has no limiting characteristics, and I think that you'll probably make the best of it. I think the people who are going to use this topic like to debate, but I think that in having a direction to go and being able to plan intelligently for how to deploy your resources, you've got a topic that is absolutely no help. So boy, do I hope that next year when people are writing the topics and when people are voting for the topics, that you just give it a second or third thought, because you have got a mess here. It is almost impossible to predict which way this is going to go. That's actually about half the reason that I've taken a little extra time trying to get my thoughts together for a couple of early suggestions. So I have two ideas that I think you might pursue looking for a good strategic affirmative, and then I have a few kind of hits from the past, standard generics whenever you have a legal topic that I'll talk a little bit about. I'll start with the affirmatives. If you do a search for something called a deferred prosecution agreement, this is something that's fairly new. It's been an option for a long time, but it was a very restricted option up until about 2008. And then there was apparently a memo, a directive that came down from the Department of Justice saying that prosecutors were a lot more free to use these things in the investigation of corporate crime, and in particular in the investigation of noncompliance within the financial services industry. And so now, today, there's a fair amount being written about how this has kind of grown out of control and it's watered down the criminal justice system's ability to respond to the kinds of financial crimes that brought about the housing crisis a couple of years ago. What a deferred prosecution agreement does is I've heard it described as kind of a gentleman's agreement, that the prosecutor will point out to the company how it could be charged, but the prosecutor will say, if you'll guarantee me this will never happen again, then you won't be prosecuted. And it was a response to some of the bad decisions made along the way in the past, such as indicting all of Arthur Andersen for what it's now widely recognized that was a pretty extreme overreaction, and a whole lot of people lost their jobs who had nothing to do with all the nonfeasance surrounding Enron that brought Arthur Andersen. Arthur Andersen's an accounting firm, if that's not familiar to you, that brought Arthur Andersen to a close and made it shut down and go bankrupt. In response to that, the United States Department of Justice, a few years down the road, it's believed, went in a different direction, became a lot more cautious about pursuing corporate crime, and the deferred prosecution agreement, the expansion of it, was really sort of a result of that. The problem is, what a lot of people are writing about today and what a lot of experienced prosecutors are saying is, when you let the companies be the ones on whom the burden falls to police themselves, this has had a lot of very negative effects. Because prosecutors are pursuing a lot fewer cases, they're missing out on the experience of what it takes to try and win those cases. And because they've gotten into the habit of relying on self-reporting from the financial services industry, the financial services industry has got a lot more proficient and a lot more clever in making persuasive presentations that make it look as though what they're doing is legal when in reality it isn't. So if you do a little reading about that, deferred prosecution agreements, I think that there is a slick little affirmative there. Now, I don't think you want to abolish them. I think that would be ridiculous and you would lose a lot. But look for a proposal for a reasonable way to rein them in, for a reasonable standard that will distinguish between an appropriate case that calls for a deferred prosecution agreement and one where it's not in order. And I think that you will have a pretty cool little affirmative there. A second thing, this goes back a fairly long way. This goes back to the mid-1990s, so almost 20 years ago. But I coached on a reform criminal procedure in pretrial detention and sentencing, which we thought was one of the biggest topics we'd ever seen. But if you think about it, it's only a tiny corner of your topic. But I remember at nationals, at the national debate tournament, one of the coaches for the University of Kansas, they had made it all the way to the semis, and they had one last affirmative that they were holding in reserve for the final round if they made it there. And what they were going to do was they were going to roll back, they were going to overrule a couple of Supreme Court decisions about harmless error. Now, the leading cases in harmless error are Chapman versus California and Harrington versus California, and they imposed two different tests for what counts as harmless error. And it's the mismatch between those two different tests and how they've been applied kind of haphazardly. And, you know, I've done a little looking, and there are still people writing about how harmless error can expand, it can grow, it can contract, it can completely swallow up what the thrust of just about any criminal case ought to be. So if you go looking for contemporary writings about harmless error and some ways that it ought to be reformed, I think you'll have an affirmative that doesn't give the negative a lot of ground, because it doesn't do very many straightforward things. It doesn't let a lot of people out of jail and out onto the streets. It doesn't make a crime less a crime or lower the sentence for a crime. It takes this almost irrational little doctrine that has been messing with the quality of the decision making in a lot of different trials over the past several decades, and it just makes it more rational. So it's one of those affirmatives where when you hear it described, it sounds like it's almost a no-brainer, but when you try to think about what does it do that we can use for a disadvantage link or to make our counterplan compete with, it's almost like there's nothing there. There's nothing you can get a grip on. So you might investigate that. Okay. A couple of negative arguments that I think you want to have in your arsenal. Well, I mean, every year someone says this, but politics is going to be huge. I think in the wake of the Casey Anthony verdict, you can stop and you can catch some things being written about public opinion, about criminals getting away with their crimes, about how there's a huge surge in public outcry, and about how politicians respond out of political pressure. There are a lot of Caylee Anthony laws being proposed all over the United States. So you want the evidence that when there are changes made in law that seem like they're soft on crime, that that's politically fatal, that that's politically poisonous. And what you do is you can take that argument, you can run it both directions, and you can get really creative in how you describe the plan as people will perceive this as being soft on crime, or people will perceive this as being hard on crime. Let me give you an example. An affirmative that we ran on the topic I described a little while ago about pretrial detention and sentencing, we changed the summary contempt law. Now, the summary contempt law is just the ability of a judge in the middle of a trial to say, bam, I find you in contempt, 30 days in jail with no trial. And it's something a judge is only supposed to do in extreme circumstances when someone in the courtroom is really acting up, has thrown a chair at the judge or something like that. Well, we lost one debate to the University of Iowa on the politics disadvantage. What they said was, it's more likely and more common for defense attorneys to get that out there and that loud and do that much misbehaving because the prosecution represents the state and has all the resources of the state at their disposal. So, changing the summary contempt power is going to be perceived as giving an advantage to defense attorneys, and it will therefore be perceived as soft on crime. Now, we only lost to that argument one time, and we felt pretty silly when we did, but it's that kind of thing, thinking an extra layer deep. You know, the affirmative can describe their plan however they want, but you are also able to describe it, and when you describe how it'll be perceived, often you can get it'll seem like it's soft on crime link, and then away you go with your politics disadvantage. Or you can win that it will be perceived the other way, it'll be perceived as tough on crime, and then you might be able to win that the plan would be popular and would advance the agenda, you know, President Obama's agenda, or would make the branches work together so something that's currently stuck will be passed, and that would be a bad thing. So first thing in your negative arsenal is to have a good, well-developed, well-updated politics disadvantage. A couple of other arguments that come in handy. One of them is court legitimacy. Court legitimacy. And a name that you might want to go looking for. This book is ancient. It's over 30 years old, but the author is still pretty well regarded and usually footnoted just about any time this is discussed. A guy by the name of Jesse Choper. Just like Chopper, but with only one P instead of two. So do some hunting for footnotes of Jesse Choper in conjunction with words like court legitimacy. And this disadvantage argues that pretty much whenever anything happens that is a major departure from the way things have happened in the courts previously, that the court loses legitimacy. It seems as though the court just goes with the flow, follows fads, and the public is then a lot less willing to abide by judges' decisions. And you can win some impacts about what that does to the strength of democracy. You can, if you go looking far enough, you can even win that developing democracies around the world, they will model changes in our court structure, and that could lead to ethnic tensions, that could lead to violent conflict. You can go looking for that sort of thing. One utility argument that's good to have in kind of a similar way to what you do with a politics disadvantage is to have a court clog disadvantage. Court clog. The idea being, if the result of the plan would be that there would be more cases in the courts, then that results in more delay. That results in more court backlog. Now, the pain in the butt with that argument is to ever win that it's unique, because our courts are always in a terminally clogged condition. But what works some of the time is if you go and you find some solvency evidence for a fairly simple reform that would speed up getting cases through the court, and you can find a lot of them out there, and then you counterplan with that. You run court clog as the net benefit, and if you can describe the plan as something, for whatever reason, that'll bring more cases into the court, then you load up on trying to win why justice delayed is justice denied, and what a terrible thing a court backlog is, and you say the counterplan alone reduces backlog more than the combination of the counterplan and the plan. And that is a good, useful utility argument to have in the file box for debates when you don't have a specific case hit on whatever it is you're debating. You also, I would say, want to invest a little bit of time in judicial federalism. One of the shortcomings of this topic is it's just said that the federal government should institute these reforms. And I think you're going to find that if you're not careful, you want to think about this with your own affirmative, and a lot of the teams you debate against may not be entirely careful, and they will write affirmatives where changes in state criminal procedure could completely eliminate the problem. And you can counterplan with changes at the state level and win judicial federalism, that the changes should happen at the state level, that the state level changes are more responsive to the needs of the people. You can also win a modeling argument in that case that nations around the world will decentralize their court systems and make them more responsive with similar impacts to what I described before. So judicial federalism is the kind of thing that I think could really be kind of a broad spectrum, all-purpose, maybe not all-purpose, but something useful in a whole lot of debates this year in those circumstances where you have to debate kind of a screwball affirmative, something that you didn't see coming. And boy, do I think there are a lot of them out there on this topic. Oh, let's see. Last, I would say, even independently of the politics disadvantage, I've known over the years some debate programs to put together, whenever there's a criminal justice or a crime topic, they'll put together kind of a soft-on-crime argument that whenever there's a change made in how crimes are prosecuted, it encourages organized crime, it encourages organized criminals, and they expand their operations. And you can even write the argument backwards. When you give prosecutors and law enforcement better and better tools to go after crime, then you can win that as kind of a police state argument. So you might want to go looking for that as well. The expansion of crime or the contraction, that, the overzealous prosecutors and the overzealous law enforcement officials as well. So I think those are some beginnings. I think that if you focus on legitimacy, on politics, on clog, on federalism, and on either soft on crime or hard on crime, you could wind up at the beginning with a good set of arguments that'll stand you in good stead in almost any situation that you didn't quite see coming. And do look into deferred prosecution agreements and possibly have a look at harmless error, because you could wind up with some affirmatives that are pretty big and pretty systemic and pretty easy to defend as topical and kind of in the mainstream of the topic, but really give you kind of a strategic foothold. And boy, encourage people to do a better job of writing the topic next year.